Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is 12:30, so we're going to get started now. Thanks to everyone for coming. My name is Rebecca Hodson. I'm one of the reference librarians here at Kish, and we like to put on fun, educational, and interesting events for the students, and this time we are really lucky to have a special event. This is the first time for me to do a faculty panel discussion, so we're going to get to hear from some of our faculty members. We have quite a lineup, so today you're going to be learning about the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, as well as The Hobbit. And so many of you may be reading this for your English courses. And I know many of you are very interested in the world of Middle-earth that Tolkien created. So you'll be very excited to hear. We are going to be hearing from many folks today. 3 of them are from the English department, our English instructors. We have Amy Smith, Tina Holtgren, and Nathan Gordon. From the psychology department, we have Terry Lynn Funston. She's going to look at some psychological aspects. And then we have Dr. Anthony Thomas talking about philosophical aspects. So we will be beginning with Amy. So, and then many of you have a blue assessment card. That's just to get a little data on it. So thanks for filling those out at the end of the event. After every faculty member presents on their little piece, we will then open it up to questions at that microphone. So hopefully you guys are thinking about questions and you can write some down. And without further ado, we will begin. So thanks everyone again for coming. Here's Amy.
All right, thank you for coming. Here is a recap of what Rebecca just mentioned and some of the topics we're going to be covering today. And I am Amy Smith from the English department, and I'll be talking about Tolkien's life and some of his contributions. Last spring, the Kishwaukee College English department selected Tolkien's book, The Hobbit, as the common text to be read by English 103 students during this academic year, the 2014-15 year. Dr. Todd West made the suggestion for this book, and instructors in the department were immediately excited about working with Tolkien's classic and delving into the world of Middle-earth and the world of Bilbo Baggins. As I was preparing my notes and assignments for the unit that my English 103 students would have on The Hobbit, I became fascinated by the life of Tolkien. I knew almost nothing about him, and I found that the more I read and studied, the more interesting he became. What I would like to share today, then, is what I believe to be relevant information about Tolkien, information that sheds light on his creation we revere today, called The Hobbit. Tolkien was born in South Africa in 1892. His parents were British, but his father, Arthur Tolkien, was working in South Africa for Lloyd's Bank. Tolkien's mother, Mabel Suffield, joined Arthur, married him in South Africa, and gave birth to John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. 2 years later, Mabel had her second child, another son, and she named him Hilary. By 1895, John Tolkien, this is J.R.R. Tolkien here, John Tolkien's health was quite poor, and his parents decided that he should return to England into cooler weather. Mabel took her 2 young sons and went home. Sadly, Tolkien's father died of rheumatic fever before the family could reunite. Less than 10 years later, Mabel, a diabetic, would die. Before her death, Mabel had encouraged reading, storytelling, art, and music in the lives of her sons, despite their sometimes poverty-stricken conditions. Also, Mabel had converted to Roman Catholicism and had appointed Father Francis Morgan to be the legal guardian of her 2 sons in the event of her death. This began Tolkien's study of and love for Catholicism, a devotion that he ultimately shared with his wife and his 4 children. Father Francis did his best to raise the Tolkien boys in Birmingham, England, ultimately moving them to a boarding house in which Tolkien met Edith Bratt, who was also orphaned. Tolkien was 16 at the time, and Edith was 19. When Tolkien turned 21, he married Edith, and they remained together until her death in 1971. 2 years before Tolkien's death. So they had a very long marriage. They had 4 children, and here's a picture of them. These photographs are difficult to see, I realize that. Some are over 100 years old, and so this is about the best quality that we'll have. But this does show Tolkien with his 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. The oldest son, John, is in the center here. He became a Roman Catholic priest. The second son is Michael, here. He went into the military, served in the Second World War. The third son, and Tolkien's left, is Christopher, and he followed closest in his father's footsteps. He became an academic. He ultimately went to work at Oxford University, where Tolkien studied and where he became a professor. Christopher also served in World War II, but followed his father's footsteps, as I said. He worked with Tolkien on drafts of The Lord of the Rings, and since Tolkien did not finish his epic tale called The Silmarillion before his death, Christopher ultimately completed the work and saw it through publication. Priscilla, the youngest and the only daughter, went on to write and to publish the Tolkien family album, telling the stories of the Tolkien family and providing the world with a glimpse into the lives of J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife and children. This panel chose Veterans Day for this presentation and discussion because Tolkien and most of his friends and colleagues were profoundly affected by the world wars. After completing his education at Oxford, Tolkien was commissioned by the Lancashire Fusiliers, but he was determined to keep up with his academic work during the war. Tolkien's biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, wrote, and here's a quote from Carpenter, "By the beginning of 1916, Tolkien had decided to specialize in signaling, for the prospect of dealing with words, messages, and codes was more appealing than the drudgery and responsibility of commanding a platoon. So he learned Morse code, flag and disc signaling, the transmission of messages by heliograph and lamp, and use of signal rockets and field telephones, and even how to handle carrier pigeons. Eventually, he was appointed signaling officer. Tolkien, though, spent less than a year serving in France. He contracted trench fever through lice, and he was sent home to recover in England. He would later write about his experience, saying, "One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel fully its oppression. But as the years go by, it seems now often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead." Because of Tolkien's love for languages, he naturally gravitated toward translation, and he was especially interested in studying Anglo-Saxon texts. He translated and wrote criticism for the Old English poems Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It was likely from the Sir Gawain story that he studied the concept of the magical ring. Although Tolkien would have known of other sources for the legend, including folk and fairy tales, short stories, and even a Wagnerian opera. During his long post-war career as professor of languages at Oxford University, Tolkien invented at least 2 complete languages, and he always maintained that his books and tales were built around the languages, not the other way around, as many believe. The language of Elvish came first, for instance, and it was followed by the story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Since The Hobbit is the novel selected for the Composition 1 students to study this year, it's important to realize that Tolkien was actively involved in a writing group during the years he was drafting and revising this book. The group was called the Inklings, and it met for nearly 2 decades, beginning in the early 1930s. Another famous member of the Inklings was C.S. Lewis, author of the Narnia Tales, and many works on his conversion to Christianity. Lewis's brother and Tolkien's son Christopher were also members of the Inklings, and these men met once or twice a week to read whatever essay, poem, or novel they were writing at the time. They critiqued each other's work, and they offered advice for improvement. The Inklings, then, was a long-standing literary circle that promoted and encouraged Tolkien's creative efforts, particularly his work in the genre of fantasy literature, like The Hobbit. This is the earliest known picture of Tolkien, here with his mother. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through my remaining slides. They're mostly examples of Tolkien's artwork. Even though many believe Tolkien to have been an extremely skilled artist, he always referred to himself as an amateur. He was given permission, though, to illustrate the first edition of The Hobbit, and at the same desk on which he wrote the novel, he also drew all the maps and painted the dust jacket in the important scenes to be added to the text. And just as a side note, I've talked with my students about this, but I wanted to bring this to the larger group. Tolkien's writing desk is actually on permanent display at the Marion E. Wade Center on the campus of Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. There, one can see letters from Tolkien, a display showing Bilbo's journey through The Hobbit, and the desk, which Tolkien sold, actually, to support a charitable organization for the elderly in England. So it's within striking distance. I saw it a couple of weeks ago. It's wonderful. Okay. Additionally, for a period of 23 years, Tolkien wrote and illustrated Father Christmas letters to his children. Tolkien arranged with the local postman to deliver the letters on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and the 4 Tolkien children often wrote back to Father Christmas throughout the year. As the years progressed and the children got older, the Father Christmas stories became more and more complex, finally adding a polar bear as a kind of literary foil to Father Christmas, with the two getting into various scrapes at the North Pole. Most interesting is that in time, the polar bear began to annotate the letters, adding what we would consider today to be sort of rude, funny comments in the margins. So Tolkien had this ongoing conversation between Father Christmas and the polar bear that he presented in letter form to his children. Here's the original 1937 dust jacket for The Hobbit, created by Tolkien. Here's his painting called Bilbo Comes to the Huts of the Raft Elves. He told his daughter Priscilla at one point that of all the artwork that he had done for The Hobbit, and it was extensive, if you look at all of the maps and drawings, the dust jacket, the paintings, of all the work, this was his favorite. Here is one of his pencil and ink drawings of Lake Town. My students in 103 are right at this point in the book, right, Megan? And so we were talking about Lake Town today. You can see how detailed this is. We were also talking about the fact that Tolkien clearly needed to be able to see what it was he was writing about. And so some of these images were done at the same time that he was composing text. Some were likely done before, some were done after. So this was part of his process for writing. And finally, one of the most famous of the Tolkien images, Conversation with Smaug. And here you see little Bilbo down, and you see his size compared to the dragon. The Hobbit, published in 1937, has become a classic work of fantasy literature, and it made J.R.R. Tolkien world famous. Even today, The Hobbit is considered by many scholars to be the original and still the best fantasy ever written. Some reports say that it has sold over 100 million copies since 1937, and it has been translated into at least 27 languages. Tolkien's story of Little Bilbo Baggins has been told through numerous forms, including stage productions, cartoon stills, an animated film, a radio drama of 8 parts, comic books, computer and video games, many of which include a copy of the written novel, which makes English teachers very happy, and of course, the 3-part live-action film released in 2012, 2013, and to come on December 19th, 2014. Tolkien himself has received numerous awards. These are very easy to look up online. Perhaps it's best to conclude by saying that in 1972, a year before his death, Tolkien was honored by Queen Elizabeth as a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, which is one of the highest honors presented by the Crown. And there is his signature. I'll turn it over to Terry Lynn.
Well, hello. Thank you, guys. I want to thank Amy because when she contacted me this summer, she said, would you mind talking about The Hobbit? And I'm like, you got to be kidding. This is awesome. Anybody who knows me knows that I love literature. And just to get an idea, how many people here have taken a psychology class? Yes. All right. Okay. What is really cool about all of this is that when we look at psychology and we look at literature, like an English class, we go, English over here, psychology over here. And yet, these guys are married to each other. We see so much of psychology in our literature and so much literature in our psychology. And I want to demonstrate that by looking at The Hobbit through some of the courses and some of the things that you have learned when you were in your psychology classes. So let's get started here. The first thing I want to talk about is when it comes to this book, you know, all of us, we were there at Middle-earth. We were there when Bilbo Baggins opened that door and each one of those dwarfs came into his home. And we were there when he was frustrated because he thought they were going to eat all of his food. We were there when he was making that decision, do I go or do I stay? We were there when those spiders were around. And we were there with the dragon. And I don't know about you, but I was scared. You know, I was standing next to Bilbo in that place, and I was scared. And we were there when Thorin died. And I felt my heart just rip open. I mean, I was so upset. I was crying. But yet, none of us were actually there. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but Middle-earth doesn't exist. I know. But see, that's what's so amazing about what he did, Tolkien. He created these amazing mental images that made us go to this other place. Because in our world, it does exist. And he does it through this incredible thing called concepts, as we all know. And concepts come in 2 forms. Now, Amy talked just a moment about how he did all this artwork. This artwork is important to us because it shows us that formal concept. He wanted us to know what Lake Town looked like. He wanted us to see what Middle-earth looks like. So when we're reading it, we know and we look at it the same way he did. But there are times where it's natural, that his people, we could tell who they were, which can be a little frustrating too. Because when I read about Bilbo Baggins, I picture him to be rather small, very tiny. I mean, Tolkien talks about the fact that he's smaller than the dwarfs. So when I saw the movie the other day, I had to stop. I got so frustrated with this thing. I took it out of the CD player and I just said, this is ridiculous, I can't watch this. Because Bilbo Baggins is the same size as the dwarfs, and that cannot happen. Not in Tolkien's world. He is very specific about that. At the same time, all of the stories, all of the songs that are in this book, They're amazing. And when I was reading it the very first time as a kid, I kind of thought of it kind of like very fun songs that were on the radio. The tunes were in my head of how, he would have had it. And yet, if you listen to the books on CD, it's so different than what was in my head, because I had that natural idea of what was going on. He doesn't sit there and say, they were solemn about this. No. He uses the songs to come out. And even in the movies, if you see the movies, it's sad, but they're not in the movies except for one song. So I get very, like most people, frustrated when I see it. My biggest frustration comes with Thorin. Another concept of that natural concept is, even though he may describe somebody, Tolkien, we picture in our mind somebody else. And I picture Thorin to be this middle-aged, but gray hair, balding, kind of wears glasses type of person. And I bet you none of you thought of that. You have your own description of Thorin. So when the movie comes out and Thorin kind of looks a little macho, kind of might have made some of you upset. So we have those formal concepts and those natural concepts. What I want to discuss right now is a little bit different, because if you've taken lifespan, we're going to look at lifespan of Bilbo Baggins for just a moment. And with lifespan, we always look at the physical, the cognitive, and the social development. And for Bilbo Baggins, he is definitely in middle adulthood stage. Now, middle adulthood physical developments, he definitely shows some qualities of this. At the beginning of the book, he really hasn't done very much. He's pretty stationary. I mean, his only real exercise is going back and forth to maybe the mailbox or sitting on his bench. He's not really doing very much, which means his skeletal system, his muscular system, and definitely his circulatory system is probably not like it used to be. So if you remember, when he goes out on that journey, he's tired at the beginning. He wants to stop. He's exhausted. And any middle adult person, and let me tell you, as a middle adult person, if you haven't been doing anything, you're tired. But we also know that by the end of his journey, he is catching up to everybody. He's fine. He's robust. He's walking home. He's not even thinking about how tiring it is. That's because of the exercise. He's getting a lot of exercise on this journey, because if you read this book, you know they're doing a lot of walking throughout this book. And so he's exercising. He's exercising more than he's ever done. And so it's actually helping. This journey is physically helping him, but it's also mentally helping him. One of the biggest areas that happens in cognitive development. And I have here crystallized intelligence and expertise. With crystallized intelligence, this is where you've accumulated knowledge about, everything from maybe all your readings that you've done, from all of your experiences that you've lived. You have done all of this. And so over the years, he has developed this expertise, which is why he is asked to be the burglar. Now, he can't figure that one out at first. He's like, why me? But he starts to realize it, that okay, I have things to give. I can actually do these things. Which brings us to his social development. He is classic Erikson's middle adulthood stage, genitivity versus stagnation. And what this means is that he has to figure out why he's going on this journey. It's not really about the gold. It's not about, this money. It's about figuring out what he can do for the next generation. Because he starts to realize, if I go on this journey, I have something to tell other people. When I come back, I'm going to tell the stories. I'm going to tell the people about my journey. And maybe they'll know something, they'll learn something from these journeys. So he's going to go on this journey for that, because he hasn't done anything. I mean, he's pretty much stayed in his home, and he's kept to himself. So he hasn't done anything for that next generation. And so Tolkien makes him go out, makes him do this. And really, this whole book is just a metaphor of why we go and do things, why we help that next generation, how we make our decisions. Because You know, he makes a lot of decisions in this book. And some of them, depending on when I read the book, I agreed or disagreed. When I was a kid, I was so mad at him. He kept that Ark of Stone and didn't give it to Thorin. And I thought, you know, a friend, if you want to be a friend, you're going to give that Ark of Stone to Thorin. Why didn't you do it? You're not a friend. But now I'm at a stage where I go, I get it. I get why he did that. You had a hard time with that too. It was a struggle, but you picked what you thought was best for this situation. And so he does this. He weighs the odds. He figures this out. Now, we've looked and journeyed now about who Bilbo Baggins is mentally, physically, and cognitively here in middle adulthood. But now let's just look a little bit about personality here, because he is very interesting. If you look at him through the eyes of Abraham Maslow, he is all over the place. He starts out in the book in what we call love and belonging needs, because he doesn't really have any friends, and he doesn't really care for his family members. So he's in search at the beginning for this relationship, and these dwarves are giving him a relationship. He's bonding with these guys. He's learning to become friends with them. However, at times, you know, things happen. It doesn't matter if you have friends or not. If you're starving, forget it. You don't care what's going on. You want food, and we know how starving they were. And so it moves down to physiological needs. There are times where they are scared. You know, those trolls come and they're worried about their safety, and the dragon, they're worried about their safety. There's so many times they're worried about their safety. And so Bilbo Baggins falls down there. But when those things are over, when those crises have been solved and everything's okay, he moves back up. And really what he starts to have is, once he's accepted by everybody, he wants to be respected. And so he moves into, I would say, most of the end of the book, he moves and fluctuates between love and belonging and esteem needs. Alfred Adler is another person I thought would be an interesting person's theory to use when we look at Bilbo Baggins and Gandalf and Thorin. Because when you think of inferiority complex, which is what Alfred Adler is the person who coined this term, Adler believed that this is when a person feels that they're never strong enough, or that they're never as intelligent or as good as everybody else. And there are many times Bilbo feels that way, because he's like, I don't think I'm a good burglar. Nobody's gonna want me to be a burglar. Why are you picking me to be a burglar? He doesn't quite feel comfortable with it. In fact, he even worries about it when people are saying you're doing a good job. He still worries about it at times. He doesn't have as much confidence as other people in whether or not he could do this job. Thorin and Gandalf, on the other hand, I would classify them in superiority complex. They're not huge in the superiority complex, but they definitely suffer it a little bit, where they believe that maybe they're a little bit better than everybody else, and their feelings that they have to be better than everybody else. I mean, Gandalf, everybody, when he comes around, everybody feels comfortable, everybody feels safe because he's there. He's that person who makes you feel safe. And Thorin wants to be that person. Everybody feels that way. You can kind of see, in my mind, I always saw clashes between Thorin and Gandalf because of that. They're both, when you have two superiority complex people, they're both clashing with each other, and we can kind of see that throughout the book. The last thing about Adler's theory that can be used kind of goes with Thorin. I didn't talk too much about Thorin. And he's a fascinating character. We could call him the oldest child. He is probably the oldest child because the kingdom is going to be his someday. And so he has a lot of pressure. And according to Alfred Adler, when you're the oldest child, you have so much responsibility. You have to work harder than everybody else. And it can be exhausting, and we can see that. When everybody else is ready to quit, not Thorin. He is not exhausted. He's exhausted, but he is not a quitter. There are times he wants to. We know he wants to, but he doesn't. And that's because for him, it's all about building that kingdom. You know, he is trying to do what his father wanted him to do, what was important for him to do. The last one I want to touch on is B.F. Skinner. And I think it's kind of funny because B.F. Skinner was a writer, if you did not know that. He was an undergraduate. His major was writing. And he only went into psychology to be a better writer. And I think Tolkien and him would have clashed a little bit because B.F. Skinner is all about utopian societies and Tolkien is not so much. When you look at this book, though, you can definitely see some classic Skinner things. His book has quite a bit of operant conditioning, where you're looking at consequences of behavior. Bilbo is constantly weighing the consequences. What will happen in the future if I do this? So when everybody's like, if you come on this journey, you'll get riches. Whatever we find, you can have some of it. So he's got to decide, do I do this or do I not? If I go, what will happen? And so he weighs those odds. He's not walking with them when they leave at first. You know, he's still weighing the odds. And then he realizes and he has to go catch up with them. Later, he's weighing the consequences of one of the hardest things, and that's the ring. He has this ring that has this power, and his ideas are, okay, if they find out, these dwarves, that I have this ring, and that's why all these things are happening, they're not going to think I'm that good of a burglar. So he doesn't tell them. But when they do find out, he's shocked by the consequences because he was expecting something bad. Instead, they're like, you're even better than we thought. You're really good. You're a really good burglar. So he realized, you know, hey, it's okay. You know, this consequences was actually pretty good. I think his biggest operant conditioning issue was with Thorin. You know, once Thorin and him were becoming friends and they're accepting each other, he wanted that respect. He needed that esteem needs. And he knew if Thorin finds out I had the Archstone and I gave it to Bard, he's not going to be my friend anymore. He's going to hate me. And he has to make that decision. And he makes that decision. And yes, the consequence was, you know, Thorin hated him for a while. But yet when he died, Thorin, he said he respected him again. He respected Bilbo. And so we can see that all of these different types of theories, all these different types of ideas that we have in psychology, we can put them into anything like we have here at the Hobbit. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn this over to Tina.
I actually have, breaking from the PowerPoint tradition here, a Prezi. My PowerPoint work would put you to sleep, and we don't want to do that. So we'll just give it a minute to load up. But let me just introduce this by saying that when Amy asked if I would be part of this panel, it was because I presented on this topic before, but it was really more to other teachers about how to help students understand the idea behind transcendental communities from early America. So we're talking about the early days of the United States when we had people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, George Ripley, Bronson Alcott, and all of these great ideas that they had, and some of them really thought that they could make these places, these perfect places to live, these communities where everybody would live happily ever after, so to speak. So when I talk about the Shire as a transcendental community, it's really with that in mind, but I'll try to, what I want to do more is introduce you to the idea of understanding Tolkien's world of the Shire as not a utopia. Like Terry Lynn was saying, Tolkien rejected the idea that the utopia was the utopia Shire concept, because it really wasn't, was it? It doesn't make me want to live there any less. Anybody here want to live in the Shire? I'm ready to go now. Should we pack? Yeah, get the moving vans. We're all ready to go. But why is that? What is that enduring appeal in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? And I've got to show you, I still have, this is my copy of the Fellowship of the Ring. And it was my brother's, and then in 1982, he gave it to me when it was my turn to read it for school, because we used to read it back then for school. And why do I still have this? Why do I still love this, you know? And it's really what led me to explore the attraction of the Shire and the hobbits and their way of life. So why do we want to go there? Here are some possible explanations. So we as humans, we're really attracted to the idea that there can be a perfect place, a perfect society where we live. People have what they need, people are equal, everybody is sort of operating on a base level. And, one of the first examples we have is Sir Thomas More, and, his utopia is, well, it's an interesting and very complex place. So we understand where Tolkien said, no, that the Shire is not a utopia. Of course, the early American transcendentalists, they wanted to try to put this into practice. And, of course, if you know something about these communities, they didn't work out very well. Brook Farm lasted a few years. Fruitlands in Harvard lasted even less. And these were experiments in early America where they wanted to put into practice some of these ideas that the transcendentalists have. Well, it's funny because it occurred to me back when I was doing this research that really the hobbits are a transcendentalist community in a shape that could never truly exist because of human nature. So where do the hobbits succeed that we as people failed? And why doesn't Tolkien want us to see the Shire as a utopian community? Why does he? Because he does reject that idea. Well, of course, he modeled the Shire after his youth, in the countryside and kind of that very simple lifestyle. He wasn't a big fan of advanced technology such as it was in his time, and he really saw the loss of that simpler culture, that simpler life. So the hobbits in the Shire really reflected that, his kind of idealized youth. So, what we can call the Shire a transcendental community safely, I think. If you call it a utopia, it really fails to recognize that it's based off of a real place that wasn't perfect. You did have poverty, you had rich, you had poor, you had people who owned land and people who didn't. So he really, while he has that idealized look at his childhood, he understands that it's not perfect and it shouldn't be thought of as the perfect place. But what the transcendentalists in early America thought of as a great ideal for our country when it was originally started really are reflected in the Shire in many aspects. And I think that's why we as Americans still have such a big enthusiasm for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And some of the quotes in this presentation are from the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book. So, if we think about what the transcendentalists viewed as an ideal government, well, it was really not much in terms of government. Most of you have heard that quote, "Government is best, which governs least," by Henry David Thoreau, which they think, he was getting from one of Emerson's essays where he says, "The less government we have, the better." So we start out with that idea that really people in the goodness of human nature, we should be able to govern ourselves. We don't necessarily need a lot of laws, a lot of bureaucracy, which Tolkien wasn't a fan of either. And we see that reflected in the Shire because we have this explanation of their government, such as it is, their military, and all these other kind of modern organizations that Tolkien purposefully minimalizes in the Shire. So you have a couple titles that Tolkien depicts. You have the mayor, otherwise known as the mayor of Michael Delving, and the Thane, which was typically the old Took, who was kind of the big cheese in the Shire. But the only duty of the mayor in the Shire was to, well, open banquets, because we know hobbits love a good banquet. And other than that, he was the postmaster, because we know hobbits love to write letters. And those of you that are reading The Hobbit, they love getting letters, they love getting presents. And of course, as the first sheriff. But we really don't see the sheriffs doing much, do we? Because ultimately, the understanding of what's needed for a military organization in the Shire and the Hobbit, and of course, the Transcendentalists kind of agree with this, is really you don't need this big standing military. You don't need a lot of complicated military organization. What you need is a small military, only when there are threats to your society. So we have that title of Thane. And this is a quote from The Lord of the Rings. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, the captain of the Shire Muster, sense of theme here, and hobbitry in arms, none of which we really see play a role in the books in a larger sense. Were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred. The thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. So it was kind of an acquiescence to old Took, that he was, everybody still kind of took his advice and acknowledged that he was somewhat in charge, but there really wasn't a need for any sort of strict supervision in that sense. The sheriffs, which is maybe our equivalent of a police force, had no uniforms, and they were in the practice rather Haywards, more concerned with the straying of beasts than people. So we really don't see a strict police force, we don't see a strict military. And last but not least, we had the bounders, who would make sure that folks like you and I, we're not wandering around the Shire stomping on flowers and getting into farmland. So we have this kind of group that's gathered up at times of need to keep out the bad influences, but not necessarily to police or supervise the citizens as a whole. And that really plays into this idea that people and the inherent goodness of human nature should be trusted and not necessarily oppressed. The other idea that plays into the idea of the transcendentalist that we see in Tolkien is interesting, because we know that he was a devout Catholic. He was raised Catholic, had a very strong religious belief, really lived his beliefs, and had kind of that unquestioning religious faith that a lot of people don't really recognize or understand about him, because it is not reflected in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. And we have to ask, why is this, okay? And we know that, of course, in early America, you had the idea of religious freedom as a really founding, operating idea. You come here, you come to this country because you want to have that religious freedom to express yourself. And I personally feel Tolkien left out any specific religious doctrine from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to kind of express that idea that those religious beliefs were personal, that he held them personal, and he felt every human being should keep them personal within themselves. And instead, he chose to deal with those religious beliefs on a wider scale of just the basic understanding of good versus evil, which is really where we see, in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, that kind of foundational battle between good. We have the hobbits, we have the good men, we have the dwarves versus evil and the ring, and that sort of really basic struggle that played into his beliefs but didn't beat people over the head with it, which is one of the reasons why I think this book has such an enduring appeal. Is it really is accessible to anybody from any religion. It really does not play into a specific doctrine. Last but not least is that belief in the beauty of the land, the belief in agriculture and sustainability, that really the transcendentalists were really interested in loving the land and valuing it for what it is and not destroying it. And we see that reflected in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, because what do hobbits love more than anything else? Well, they love food, yeah, they do. I mean, and we understand, though, that they connect that love of their meals and their first and second breakfasts and, 11sies and all those great meals that I would love to eat every day, but, it doesn't quite happen for me. We see that reflected in how they value their land. They love, for they love the peace and quiet and good-tilled earth, well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They did not and do not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. So that real basic understanding that agriculture needs to be sustainable, and if you give to the land, it's going to give back to you. And that appeals to us because we know that, in this, especially in modern times, that the less we value our land, our farmland, and our green spaces, the more we lose it. But Tolkien doesn't want us to look at the Shire and go, oh, it is the perfect place, it is a utopia. They're really, and this is actually a quote from him, and that, I apologize for that font, it looked really great small, and now it just looks like, wow. And this is actually a font based off of his Elvish writing, and this is a quote from him: "Hobbits are not a utopian vision or recommended as an ideal." And he doesn't want us to idealize them, because we see in The Hobbit, and part of why they're so real for us is because they squabble, they have arguments, they have relatives that they don't want to stop by, that they ignore at the door. If it was today, it'd be caller ID, but back in the day, you just didn't look through the peephole. He really wants us to just enjoy them as kind of a simpler time, because Tolkien wasn't, if we want to pin him down and say, oh, he would have come over here and been, a great proponent of our, our ideas about government, and he really wasn't. He didn't like to be pinned down in that way, because he did live through 2 world wars, and he did have that perspective. And I love this quote from him, because he's specifically saying, he backs away from those political labels, because when you start to compartmentalize and label your beliefs, you want to start to force other people into those templates. And then what you get, of course, he says here, is not smallness, universal smallness and humility, but universal greatness and pride, till some orc gets a hold of a ring of power, and then we are getting slavery. So he wants us to resist that. The Shire is not a utopia. We don't want to put these labels onto people and places and ideas, because essentially that will diminish them. And this is just a nice drawing of the Shire and how, really this is his maybe not perfect world, but this is the world that he sees as a better time and a simpler place, which really is what the early American transcendentalists were interested in as well. So I hope that's a little parallel that you can take with you when you read these, and hopefully it inspires you to read The Lord of the Rings as well, because a lot of these quotes are from the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay if I step away from this? I want to be confined. Okay, that's a quick question. How many of you have read The Hobbit? How many of you have seen some of the movies? How many of you love this story? Some of you put your hands down right there. But most of you got them up. I don't know how many of you I'm going to insult by what I'm about to say. When I was asked to talk about the philosophical implications and stories, philosophical ideas that are in The Hobbit, I didn't want to do it. I had not read this book in all of my life. to the vulgar and to ordinary talents, but to triumph over the disasters and terrors of mortal life is the privilege of the great man. Have you ever noticed sometimes people who are bad people thrive and do well? Some of us find that really frustrating. Bad people seem to succeed in this life. Here's Seneca saying, prosperity can come to those folk, but to triumph over the disasters of mortal life is the privilege of the great man. To be lucky always and to pass through your life without gnawing of the mind is to be ignorant of the half of nature. You are a great man, but how can I know if fortune has never given you a chance to display your prowess? You say that you're great, how can I know if you've never been tried or challenged? I can say, I account you unfortunate because you've never been unfortunate. You have passed through life without an adversary. No man can know your potential, not even you. For self-knowledge, testing is necessary. Boy, isn't that sort of theme of law? For self-knowledge, testing is necessary. No one can discover what he can do except by trying. Second passage from Seneca. Ideas. And I highlight something here in red that I think maybe sort of ties directly to the Hobbit. So God hardens and scrutinizes and exercises those he approves and loves. God tests those that he cares the most about. But those he appears to indulge and spare, he is only keeping tender for disasters to come. Why does God afflict every good man with sickness or grief and misfortune? And this he true of the people, persecuted by a lot of things. Jesus gets crucified. Martin Luther King gets assassinated. Gandhi gets assassinated. Because in the army, too, I didn't know anything about Tolkien's experiences in the army. This is Seneca talking about in the army. The most hazardous duties are assigned to the bravest soldiers. In the case of good men, accordingly, the gods follow the plan, the teachers follow with their pupils. They demand more effort from those in whom they have confident expectations. What wonder then if God tries noble spirits with sternness? Demonstration of courage can never be gentle. Fortune scourges us, we must endure it. It's not cruelty but a contest. I pointed to some of you are our students. When we give you a hard test, the reason for that. And we got to get to Nietzsche. Oh, we got to get to Nietzsche. Yes, this is a long quote, but the stuff I read struck me as very interesting. When I read back, and I read this, haven't read this in years, but when I finished The Hobbit, I went back and I found this passage because I always liked it. And parts of it stood out to me in a different way. Oh boy, huge, isn't it? What the heck? I welcome all signs that a more manly, a warlike age is about to begin, an age which above all will give honor to valor once again. Nietzsche said, I look forward to a more warlike age. For this age shall prepare the way for one yet higher, and it shall gather the strength which this higher age will need one day, this age which is to carry heroism into the pursuit of knowledge, and wage wars for the sake of thoughts and their consequences. To this end, we now need many preparatory, valorous men. Nietzsche, yes, right? People. Men and women. Who cannot leap into being out of nothing any more than out of the sand and slime of our present civilization of metropolitanism. Men who are bent on seeking for that aspect in all things which must be overcome, willing to enter into challenges to things that need to be overcome. Men characterized by cheerfulness, patience, unpretentiousness, and contempt for all great vanities, as well as by magnanimity and victory and forbearance regarding the small vanities of the vanquished. Magnanimity. When you win, you don't flaunt it. Remember the time when the Hobbit steals the keys? I think it's from the elves. Cops. And he steals the keys, lets out all of his friends, and then returns the keys. To show a little grace in victory. Men possessed of keen and free judgment concerning all victors and the share of chance in every victory and every fame. Men who are in greater danger, more fruitful and happier. For believe me, the secret of the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment of existence is to live dangerously. Build your cities under Vesuvius, the famous volcano in Italy. Right? Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your peers and yourselves. I'm telling you about fight with people. Be robbers and conquerors. As long as you cannot be rulers and owners, you lovers of knowledge. Soon the age will be past when you could be satisfied. Soon the age will be past when you could be satisfied to live like shy deer hidden in the woods. At long last, the pursuit of knowledge will reach out for its due. It will want to rule and own, and you will.
As we're all touching on different aspects here, I've realized that maybe we should have started with a sort of a spoiler warning, I guess. But I think I think everyone is probably through The Hobbit, certainly. So just a little bit here. My background is in English with a focus in literature and film studies. So I teach a literature and film course here, and I teach an intro to film course. And so I thought for my piece in the presentation here that I would like to give you some tools, I suppose, to go out and as you watch adaptations and consider them, that you have some tools that you can work with here. So if you are like Terry Lynn and you have a specific vision of Thorin then as perhaps someone a little bit past his prime, perhaps someone who's in need of some glasses and maybe balding, then you might prefer the Rankin and Bass vision of Thorin, perhaps, as opposed to Peter Jackson's vision of Thorin. Right? This is, I suppose, a lower level starting point in terms of thinking about adaptation. That how do we take what is in the work and adapt it visually so that we have something that we're familiar with and that we can agree with, I suppose, in many different respects. Part of that can be this beginning step here in terms of what we have coming onto the screen. There are a couple different ways to go about this, and I don't have many slides here. I only have really just a few more. In terms of adaptations, we can work with narrative elements and fidelity. So if we're looking at an adaptation from the perspective of narrative elements, then we would have something that is maybe a close adaptation or a loose adaptation or intermediate as a nice combination of the two. Right? So I've put some examples up here of what might be close adaptations just in terms of the narrative elements, just in terms of the story elements. Films like Clueless, as kind of hokey as it is now, I suppose, to look back into that 1990s film, it is a very good adaptation of Emma from the narrative perspective. Watchmen, perhaps you've seen, River runs through it. Loose adaptations that maybe take pieces and elaborate from those sections might be some like Blade Runner, Scott Pilgrim, or Solaris. If you've seen Scott Pilgrim, I wanted to add that one in here because I figured it was maybe a pretty popular one. And if you've read the graphic novels, you know that there are 7 graphic novels and that they've all been worked into the one film. So instead of, say, taking one book like The Hobbit and making 3 movies out of it, here we have a case where there are 7 graphic novels and now we're just going to have 1 movie. So you can imagine that the film is a kind of looser adaptation because it's going to throw out a lot that's from the graphics. For fidelity, we're talking about faithfulness. So is it faithful to the letter of the original or to the spirit? A film that is adapted to the letter is perhaps more like, maybe a kind of masterpiece theater edition of something is a good way to think about it. So 3 that I've put up here for the letter might include any of the Harry Potter movies, I suppose, but particularly I would say the first one. The Innocents, which is a great adaptation from Turn of the Screw from Henry James' work. And Fight Club, if you've seen Fight Club, I think that's a pretty good adaptation to the letter. If a film is going to be adapted to the spirit of the work, then there will be perhaps some liberties taken in many ways. So the 3 that I've put up here are Great Expectations, Sleepy Hollow, and Forbidden Planet. If you've seen Forbidden Planet, it is one of the great science fiction films of our time. It is an adaptation of The Tempest by William Shakespeare. So these films that are adapted to the spirit get more at the crux of the novel, the gist of it, something along those lines, where we don't need a very strict adaptation with all the character names the same, etc., but something a little looser in that regard. I wanted to bring in just a quick example specifically for Tolkien, and so This is just a little bit in terms of thinking about structure. So if you've read the Lord of the Rings books, specifically the Two Towers, you know that Two Towers is divided into two main sections, and that you will read book 3 and you will follow the adventures of Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas and the Battle of Helm's Deep and all that. And then, okay, intermission, now let's switch on over and we're going to go ahead and follow Frodo and Sam and Gollum as they work through the rest of the novel. So from an adaptive standpoint, if we're going to adapt this very strictly to the letter and we're going to adapt by narrative form, would you as an audience want then Peter Jackson to say, okay, sit down, you're in for 45 minutes of Aragorn, and then we're going to switch it on over, and you're going to follow the rest of the crew for the rest of the film? You probably wouldn't want that, right? So film as an art form can do different kinds of things, and we have different expectations when we come to it. And so we want to see some cross-cutting, and we know that the events are happening at the same time, and we want to see them unfold like that, and we don't just want to have these two giant chunks to work through. Some information here just on different tracks, as they're called, between the two mediums, as Robert Stam calls them. That with a novel, you have a single track medium that really just working with text. Maybe you have some art, I suppose, in there too for some visuals. But film is a multi-track medium. And so while it can have some text on the screen, as some films do, you also have these other tracks that you are continuing to work with as well. A quote here at the bottom from Brian McFarlane. The film has a right to be judged as a film. It is its own art form. It is doing different things. It can do different things. In many ways, an adaptation can be like, say, a cover version of a song. You don't want the cover version to be exactly the same as the original. Why would you? Why would you even have a cover version then if you're just going to do the same thing as the original? It can be the same with adaptation. A couple more quotes here from Brian McFarlane. So. Just as Dr. Thomas likes Seneca, I suppose I like Brian McFarlane as well. So he says here, fidelity is obviously very desirable in marriage, but with film adaptations, I suspect playing around is a bit more effective. So again, I think as you continue to read your favorite books and as you continue to watch the adaptations of them, to think about maybe what filmmakers are trying to do and maybe what they're trying to accomplish, which might be a little bit different from the novel. One final quote here, when viewing the film version of a novel or play, they know, and this is the readers, they want to find in the film what they valued in the literary work without asking whether this is the sort of thing film can do. These are two different artistic mediums. And what I really want you to take away from this is to know that they are two artistic mediums, and you can do some similar things, and you can do some different things. And if you have certain strengths in film, you can certainly play to those strengths and do something a little bit different. All right. Thank you. So I believe